Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Sermeyorsk, where the Russians have launched a new assault towards the village. This has happened here to the west of the village, pushing through the high grounds in the area to reach Sermeyorsk. There are reports that they've reached the first houses, but there's no definitive conclusion as to whether or not the Russians have managed to gain a foothold and secure those first houses. Fighting is taking place in the southern parts, where the Ukrainians have some fortifications prepared in the area that the Russians are fighting towards. And in the western parts, the Russians have approached the outskirts of the village from both the western and northwestern parts. With this, it is likely that the Russians will hit the road here to the northwest of Sermeyorsk and try to gain control over the village by pressuring from the entirety of the western and southern parts. In the direction of Oshina, heavy fighting is taking place as well as the Russians continue to pressure the Ukrainian positions there. Taking a look at the topographic map, we see here to the west of Sermeyorsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over the yellow line, which is the high ground positions here over the red area, which is 170 meters elevation, compared to Sermeyorsk being only 116 meters, so over a 15-meter advantage. This is why the Russians will look to push towards the road, as that is also located by the high ground, and at the same time it will be a supply line towards Sermeyorsk as well as the one to the north. Cutting off one of them will allow the Russians to push through with their own armored vehicles and at the same time have the Ukrainian supply lines to the area. At the same time, we're likely going to see armored assaults from the south to push towards Sermeyorsk and help gain a foothold for the Russian soldiers. Combined with assaults towards Oshina, which is located slightly higher elevation than Sermeyorsk, across the river line, it is a dual offensive by the Russians towards both villages at the same time, before the fighting will move further northwards towards Makiyivka and other areas. So you see that the Russians are pressuring the Ukrainian positions in both Oshina and Sermeyorsk to further spread out the Ukrainian forces by doing these offensive operations all the way down south to Robotyne and north towards Kupiansk. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have started assaults here to the northeast, gaining a foothold within the city, advancing to the northern parts of the fortifications, and as I've mentioned multiple times in my analysis, it is clear that the Russians are pushing here through the central parts and from the northeastern parts to lock and envelop the Ukrainian positions, fortifications, and higher ground buildings here in the area, which would put heavy pressure on the Ukrainian positions within the city and possibly enable a collapse of the front. We see that the northern parts in the residential area, they are all just normal buildings, while in the central parts of the city and here by the eastern parts of the city, there are multiple high-rise buildings as well as apartment blocks. These are all well fortified in comparison to the residential area to the north. Taking a look at the topographic map, we also see that the central parts of the city are located on the high ground in comparison to the northern parts in the residential areas. In the eastern parts, there are the section here with the high-rise buildings. We see that these are the apartment blocks here to the east of the city, and this is the area with the fortifications. So with the Russian advance here to the northeast, they are advancing through the low ground to push into and gain a foothold within the city, which they have managed to do, and they will likely continue to push towards the high-rise buildings in the northern parts as the Russians push through the central parts by the intersection with the roundabout, the gas station, etc. here in the middle, to push through and connect the two sides. Therefore, while others incorrectly claim that the city of Krasnohorivka have already fallen due to the collapse of the industrial zone, we still see, and in my correct analysis, the Ukrainians still have the high-rise buildings, the apartment blocks in the central and eastern parts of the city, which the Russians had to gain control of before they can actually start the beginning of the collapse of Krasnohorivka. But even then, there's a lot to fight through in the northern parts of the city, as the Russians will have to push through these layers of residential areas. The Russians have significantly improved their positions and their capabilities since the Battle of Bakhmut, for example, where the Russians took a very long time to capture such residential areas. But nowadays, the heavy Russian artillery and FAB bomb strikes have significantly improved the positions and the abilities of the Russian stormtroopers, allowing them to advance much quicker. It is unlikely that the Ukrainians will withdraw from Krasnohorivka, as they are currently trying to hold on to the front as much as possible to slow down any Russian advances. Even if they withdraw out of the city, they'll likely withdraw to fortified positions around it, as this is the 2014 line of defense. There are hardly any fortifications beyond that of Krasnohorivka. This means with the control of Krasnohorivka by the Russians, the Ukrainians will be pushed back multiple kilometers in every direction, as they would have no place to stand by and defend other than the city itself. This is why it's unlikely that they will withdraw, as there's no defensive positions other than the city itself, and they'll try to hold on to it for as long as possible. This means a Russian control of the city would take place after heavy fighting for many days or even weeks to come. Moving further north here in the direction of the south of Pervomaisk, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations in the pocket, trying to clear it bit by bit. They've managed to advance a bit towards the first Ukrainian fortifications in the area, and fighting will continue towards the central parts here. When the Russians have gained control over the fortifications here to the east of Nevelske, the rest of the pocket will collapse and the Russians will close it quickly. This is why we're seeing the push going through here from the southern parts to gain control of the fortifications and then move on towards Nevelske, where the third battle of Nevelske will begin, as the Russians will look to regain control of it after they lost it just a few days ago. Moving a bit further north, we see here in the direction of Belorivka, the Ukrainians are slowly pushing back the Russians by attempting to regain some positions and successfully doing so to the north of the village, regaining control over the high grounds here in the area after pushing back the Russians. We're seeing that the Ukrainians are holding on to Belorivka very strongly, as they refuse to allow the Russians to advance much before launching these counterattacks endlessly to regain some of these lost positions. They're holding on to the high ground at all costs to prevent the loss of the village. We see that the high grounds here in the northern parts and the hill itself here to the south are all very well protected by the Ukrainians, but we're seeing that over the past few months the Russians have been inching closer along the hill and to the east. But with this very slow advance, we see that this is a lowly prioritized position for the Russians, and the Ukrainians are highly prioritizing it, making it very difficult for the Russians to push through. Further north here in the direction of Novoselivsk, there is a map correction showing that the Ukrainians have control over this area south of Novoselivsk. This will likely indicate that the Ukrainians may be attempting some offensive operations here in the direction of the village to try and regain control of it. In regards to the upcoming Russian offensive, there are further reports of additional Russian troops being sent here to the front near Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk. It is reported by multiple sources that the Russians are day by day increasing the amount of soldiers and equipment in the area, and this made me think back to one of the first videos I ever made on a Russian offensive, and that is this analysis by this Polish former lieutenant colonel and currently defense advisor, who made this analysis about a possible upcoming Russian offensive, and in it he mentions the Zapad exercises of 2017, where he talks about how the Russians in this exercise, together with the Belarusians, had their focus on two things. The first one is the incorporation of both the Russian and Belarusian army into one fellow command, of both sides being united into one, and the second part is to rapidly redeploy troops from Russian areas towards northern Belarus. It is said that this training exercise was an important one when it comes to rapidly redeploying troops for the Russians and has significantly improved their capabilities. And this is something that we have seen in the Ukraine war, when the Russians rapidly redeployed troops from one area to another to launch offensive operations, similar to the direction of Avdiivka, where the Ukrainians first saw a small grouping of Russian troops and expected a smaller attack, but then suddenly the Russians, in a matter of a few days, rapidly redeployed troops, building up a larger attack force, which allowed them to make significant advances on the first few days, as the Ukrainians were not able to prepare for it properly. And this is a large scale of that sense. The exercise itself held that the first 24 hours, about 20,000 troops would be redeployed, and then in the additional 72 hours, between 60 to 100,000 troops would be redeployed. And this is something that he mentions in his analysis. he mentions that there was going to be 3 different steps to this operation. The first one is the gathering of Russian troops near the Belgorod and Kursk regions, where they would build up their troops to launch offensive operations. Then within the first 24 hours, they'll start an offensive operation where they'll push through here in the northern parts in the Sumy direction and in the Belgorod direction towards Kharkov, towards Sumy, and in between the two towards Poltava. Then there will be a rapid redeployment of Russian troops to send to these fronts to help with a second push within the 72 hours, and then a third redeployment that isn't rapid but over a long period of 2 to 3 weeks, which would help for a third wave of Russian troops towards Sumy and Kharkiv. This means even if the Russians only have about 100,000 troops in the area, it is currently about 50,000, but increasing that to 100,000 would take a few weeks. Having 100,000 troops to attack Sumy, Kharkiv, and the area in between towards Poltava is not enough, but rapidly redeploying an additional 50 to 100,000 in the next few days would allow the Russians to have enough to fight these areas, and if the Ukrainians rapidly redeploy their own troops to defend, then the Russians would have an additional 2 to 3 weeks for an additional 100,000 troops to be sent, which would add up all the way to 300,000 troops in the northern section of the front line. And the whole objective of the Russians here would be to completely encircle the majority of the Ukrainian army here in the east. At the same time, a second phase would also take place in the south, in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, moving towards Dnieper River and the city of Dnieper, as well as pushing through from the Sumy and Kharkiv regions towards the Dnieper River in the north to completely cut off any supplies across the Dnieper River and completely cut off the Ukrainian army in the east. The objective would not be to capture Kharkiv, but to bypass it and isolate it from the rest of the Ukrainian forces. All of this would be to completely isolate the eastern parts, as we see with this image here very clearly. These are pockets of Ukrainian forces. Kharkiv, Sumy, Poltava, all of them will be bypassed and isolated from the rest, and due to the Russian manpower, which is significantly larger than when the Russians first started their offensive operations, they will be able to hold their positions even without holding the cities. This is something different from the start. The Russians in the start would not be able to hold the cities that they had bypassed due to the lack of manpower. But today the Russian army has anywhere between 600 to 1 million troops in Ukraine, of which about 300 or 400,000 are actually needed in the eastern front, which means between 200 to 600,000 could be sent towards the north and other parts of the front to gain control over the majority of the east of the Dnieper River. This could be the eastern operation, which I made multiple analysis about an upcoming Russian offensive, the multiple different possibilities, and it is clear based on this that the Russians could launch a massive offensive from the east, not limited to just the city of Kharkiv, but the entire east of the Dnieper River with the manpower they have available and everything else. You can read this analysis yourself or watch my video on it. I'll link both in the description and in the comment section. And that'll be all for this video. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.